Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome at this LERU launch event for a new LERU paper called Communicating with Integrity, Supporting Researchers with Best Practice in Communication. My name is Kurt de Ketelaar. I'm the Secretary General of the League of European Research University, and I'm happy that you're all attending in such big numbers this launch event. You will know that communicating research findings is a central part of the mission of researchers and research institutions. Such communication can only truly be effective if research communications are trusted. And such trust can be impacted by poor quality science communication, including a lack of openness, overhyping findings, or failure to communicate uncertainty. So how can research institutions support their researchers in communicating research results effectively and with integrity? And what can researchers do to ensure that their communications cover relevant points for communicating with integrity? This and many more issues, ladies and gentlemen, will be discussed during this online launch event of the new LERU paper. We will start off with the presentation of the paper by the lead author. That presentation will be followed by a panel debate with 3 panelists that we have invited. And then after that panel debate, you all will have the possibility to ask questions to the lead author and the panel member. Upon the invitation, you already got the summary of this new LERU paper. The full paper will be online by the end of this event, so don't worry about that. Also, this webinar will be put on YouTube so that you can always have a look afterwards once the event has been finished. I suggest that we immediately start off now with the presentation of the paper by its lead author, Dr. Rhys Morgan. Rhys, who is a historian by training, is presently the head of policy, governance, and integrity in the Research Strategy Office of the University of Cambridge, one of our UK members. Rhys has over a decade of experience supporting research ethics and integrity at universities, and he's also a member of the LERU Research Integrity Group. Rhys, thanks again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kurt, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to this event, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to come and speak to you about the paper and about communicating with integrity. As Kurt said, my name's Rhys Morgan, and I work at the University of Cambridge, where I head up a team supporting a range of research-related administrative tasks, but particularly around research integrity and good research practice. And I'm also a member of the LERU Research Integrity Group. And I want to start firstly by being very clear that that I am not the sole driver and author of this this paper, and it is very much kind of arisen from a discussion or several discussions that were held among 2 groups within the LERU family, and hopefully that is what gives the paper its insight and its usefulness for the community. So firstly, the discussions began in the LERU Research Integrity Group, which is made up of a range of people, including people like me who support the administrative functions of integrity within universities, but also researchers involved in chairing research integrity committees and ombudsman roles from across Europe. And the aim of that group is to identify, share best practice, and to try and look forward to where we should be taking the research integrity agenda, our support for colleagues across our universities, and what we can do to improve what we do. And we started a discussion with the LERU Directors of Communication and Public Affairs Group, which is a similar group but bringing together the heads of communications teams from across LERU universities and bringing with them a great wealth of expertise and skill across the research communications piece. And so both groups have helped to inform both the ideas and also the content of the paper. And so I want to give a big thanks to everybody who was involved and gave their time, effort, and knowledge to the work. So firstly, I want to give a little bit of background of the sectorial space when we started looking at this issue and why we started looking at it. So as many of you will be aware, the European Research Code of Research Integrity was renewed in 2023. And the LERU Research Integrity Group was looking at that to think about what we could do using that as inspiration to build our guidance and support in research integrity. And one thing that jumped out at us from the guide was the expectations around research communication. So one of the things that you can see on the screen are some quotes from the document that expectations on researchers include honesty in developing, undertaking, reviewing, reporting, but also communicating research in transparent, fair, full, and unbiased ways. But also that researchers need to be transparent about their communication, their outreach, and their public engagement, and about the assumptions and values influencing the research, including uncertainty. And I'm going to come back to that issue of uncertainty in detail in the course of this short talk. So this was the kind of the seed of the discussion that led to this paper. And also we brought in similar expectations and principles from national codes. So there are many, but I'm going to just highlight two. So firstly, the UK Concordat to support research integrity, which is obviously the one that I'm most familiar with, includes expectations around transparency and open communication when presenting work to the public. And the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research goes further and in more detail to say that we must only communicate to the general public research results if there's sufficient certainty about them. And these ideas and principles are found in many of the codes of conduct that exist across Europe. So we began to think about these issues, and in our discussions, we came to the conclusion that research communication is really something that, as research integrity professionals within the research integrity group, we didn't feel comfortable that we were doing enough. So most of us in our institutions have extensive programs to support building a culture of research integrity. And by that we mean giving our researchers the skills, the knowledge, the expertise to integrate and embed research integrity in everything they do. However, for most of us, this has been something that goes from the inception of a research idea all the way through to formal publication. So through to bringing publishing an idea in a journal, publishing an idea in a book. And often the way that we've worked has ended the process there. And the reason we feel that has often been the case is that research integrity professionals and trainers and those who work in this area don't necessarily feel expert in research communication skills and techniques, and instead rely on the kind of support that is provided by research communications teams. And so we started to think about what we could do and to improve this and to find ways forward. And the reason we felt this was important is that while clearly research integrity, the process through to the publication in a journal is hugely vital and a core part of what we do, research communication is also hugely important. So clearly, as publicly funded research institutions, as most universities are, We have an obligation to the public, to the governments who have given us funding, to charities who are supporting our research, to communicate our results as widely as possible, to get out into the media, into social media, so that we can get the findings of our research, the product, ultimately what people have paid for as government, and get the maximum spread of that information, the maximum benefit of the work that's been done. But clearly, in order for this to have impact, for it to have benefit, it's important that what we put out there, what we communicate, and of course the communicators themselves are trusted. So when anyone listens to a university researcher, reads what they have to say, that they trust what is being said, and are able to take that knowledge, that learnings, and benefit from it in some way. And of course, as for any sort of output of research, that trust can be undermined if we don't do things properly. So if we communicate poorly, if we communicate in a way that doesn't have integrity, then that can undermine trust, and that can undermine the benefit of research for the public and for other stakeholders. The other thing that we discussed in detail is that research communication is increasingly important. So as I've indicated, it always has been important to get out there and to talk to the public. But there are a number of drivers that are meaning this is coming up the agenda in terms of the importance for researchers' everyday life and the kind of core mission of university research. So firstly, research impact. So research impact has been with us for some time now. In the UK, the Research Excellence Framework has included assessment of research impact for many years. But it is of increasing importance. So the amount of focus placed on it by assessment exercise is increasing. The amount of focus from funders around assessing and demonstrating impact is increasing. And of course, research communication is a key part of that. If we are able to get impact out of research, getting that communicated out to a wide group is, of course, a key part of the success of that. Secondly, we have alternative metrics or alt metrics, other ways of measuring success of research. They try to find alternatives to more standard assessment processes such as journal impact factor. And these do often focus on the spread of a message. So they look at things like media coverage, they look at whether things have been picked up in policy, and all of those can be driven by research communication. And then finally, the open science agenda. So clearly, this is another core mission, trying to ensure that our research is as open as possible, so that people can make use of it. And again, research communication is a key part of that, and indeed kind of inherent to it. So all of these things mean that research communication has become of much greater importance to a researcher, and importantly also in how they are assessed, and how they are considered for promotion and for new roles. And so, as we kind of indicate in the paper, there is a risk that there is an increased pressure on researchers to communicate, and increased expectation for them to do so. And this means that we really do need to make sure they have the skills, the knowledge, and the expertise to go out into the world and do the things that we expect of them. And we need to make sure that they can do that with integrity. So before I go into detail on the paper, I'm just going to finish what we are kind of thinking about the topic. So we started thinking about what we could do about it. And the two core things that we felt were necessary was firstly to start to build up a narrative that integrates research integrity and research communication more effectively. So we felt that in the research integrity communications that we do, this isn't often done as well as it could be, and it could be something that through a kind of communication from LERU, we could try to emphasize this. And secondly, we started talking to our research communications colleagues who were already doing excellent work in terms of research communications training and skills development, and start to work with them to inform what they're doing with some of the ideas and the expertise that we have from the research integrity point of view, so that we can ensure that people have the skills that they need to communicate with integrity on a kind of wider scale. So for the second half of my presentation, I'm going to focus in on the three key areas that we felt were important for us to focus on, and to start looking at what institutions can do and what researchers can do to help to ensure that the research that we have has integrity. So the first key area that the paper focuses on is openness. So as those of you who are from a research integrity background will know, honesty, transparency, and openness are the absolute core of the messaging and the work and training that we do in research integrity to ensure that the integrity of our research is upheld. And we have given lots of thought and lots of work has been done to train researchers and give them the knowledge of how to present their work openly in scholarly communications. This might be through declaring conflicts of interest, through being open about the weaknesses or alternative views that might exist counter to their research. And all of those things we expect our researchers to do well and to do across their scholarly work. But an academic publication, a book or a journal, gives a lot of space for researchers to do that. So you have a lot of leeway to say what you need to say, to present the conflicts or other kind of weaknesses in ways that are often well established in the kind of journals and other publications. Wider research communications can often be different. So they're a lot more succinct. So we can't give as much space to these communications, and they're often time pressured. So this decreases the opportunities the researchers have to provide the transparency that they might in a journal article or in a book. And this can result in perhaps unclear and in some cases misleading messages if not done correctly. And so this is something that we felt needed to be focused on. And so the paper makes a number of recommendations around both what institutions can do, but also what researchers can do themselves. So firstly, we recommend that research integrity professionals in universities try to widen their messaging to include research communication. So that might be in the training that they offer. It might be in the policies and procedures that they have in place to ensure that when researchers do think about research integrity or are talked to about research integrity, that it's clear that these issues of being open and transparent extend also to these latter stages of the research process, to the research communication that they need to do. Secondly, in terms of our guidance and training that we offer, what we are recommending is that universities in those trainings think about the various scenarios and the various contexts in which researchers might be communicating, be that directly to the media, be that on social media, through interviews, through on television, etc. All of these require different skills and approaches in order to be kind of open and transparent about what we're doing. And so to give that kind of communication skills is hugely important. As part of that, it's really important that we empower researchers to resist any undue pressure to communicate in ways that they are not comfortable with. So it can be in these kind of more back and forth and fast communications scenarios, that people might try and encourage a researcher to make a statement that is perhaps stronger than they normally would, or to present something perhaps without giving the kind of detail and background that is necessary to truly understand what it is that they need to communicate. And then finally, universities need to think about how they can train researchers to balance the openness that they need in these communication settings with the other expectations that exist for researchers, particularly around protecting sensitive data, confidential data, so they can handle that, the countervailing forces in the expectations that exist for them. And then, supported by their institutions, we recommend that researchers also think about how they communicate and how they can communicate openly. So in particular, when going into these communications scenarios, to think in the first case about what the audience needs to know in order to truly understand the research. So are there other contributors to the paper or to the work who need to be properly acknowledged? Is there a conflict of interest that you have that the audience needs to know about? Are there key sources that you've built work on? All of these things that you would think about for a professional publication, we need to be thinking about these things for research communication as well. And then to think about what the medium you're working in means. So what opportunities are there to communicate some of these things through those mediums? Sometimes those might be quite substantial and sometimes those might be limited. So you might need to focus in on the really important things, the things that an audience really needs to know in order to understand. And finally, if there are hurdles to open communication, be that the medium itself, be that the nature of the research, plan ahead to how we can overcome these challenges. So effectively, to kind of conclude on this, what we're recommending to researchers is that they think carefully before going into these communication scenarios and plan how they are going to be open, so that they're not caught off guard, and they don't accidentally communicate in a way that isn't as open as they would like. So the second area that we focused on is this issue of communicating uncertainty, and I've touched on this a little bit already, but we'll go into a bit more detail. So research communication mediums can encourage a compelling narrative, and that's important. So, if we want our research to have impact, we need to catch people's imagination, we need to encourage people to engage, but this can be at the expense of clarity as regards uncertainty and the true importance of the research. As Kurt said at the beginning, it can lead to kind of overhype or overemphasis of the importance of the research at the expense of a true understanding of the facts of the matter. So again, this has the potential to mislead the audience and to undermine trust, and that is what we're trying to avoid. But this isn't easy. So this is layered on top of what we've already talked about the difficulties of communicating in these sorts of environments. Communicating uncertainty in research communication is a skill, something that really does need to be learned, and not everybody naturally has that ability. And so as such, it is something that we think needs to be a key focus for research integrity and research communication. So we want our institutions to look at how our communications and research integrity teams can work together to make training on communicating uncertainty easily available to the research community, so that this is a skill that everybody who goes out and communicates widely has as part of their kind of armory of skills and expertise. But also that we provide advice and guidance to researchers across kind of a range of scenarios, but particularly I think on the issue of preprints. So preprints is something that came up repeatedly in our discussions around uncertainty, and is a challenge for researchers to communicate the status of something that is a preprint. So by that I mean something that hasn't yet to be peer reviewed, so it hasn't gone through the peer review structure, but has been put out into the public domain, often in a preprint server as part of the kind of open communication kind of commitments that our universities have signed up to. But often those can be picked up at an early stage because often they're new and exciting findings. And in order to communicate those effectively, it's important that we're clear that these are still early stage findings and haven't been through the peer review process. And so this is something that researchers sometimes need to get support, guidance, and training on how to do effectively. And so moving on to researchers themselves. So again, a lot of this is about how we plan for communication and then what we do when we're there. So being clear about the stage that research is at. So has it been peer reviewed? Is it early stage? Is it a low sample size and you're moving on to a larger study in the future to try and kind of dig into the findings and work out whether this is truly the kind of explanation that explains what you're looking into? Are there alternative explanations out there that a reader should be made aware of in addition to your own? And also then to think about the medium of communication. So is it a suitable medium? So if you've got a piece of work that is nuanced, that is early stage, that has a low sample size, is it appropriate to communicate it in a medium where you can't get that message across, where you can't make it clear that, that the research has further to go before it could be it should be treated in the same way as something that has been peer reviewed, has large sample sizes, etc. And might you take a different approach for your communications in a way that perhaps you could communicate that? And then finally, clearly, as I've indicated, communicating uncertainty is a lot easier when you have a lot of time and space, and often that information will be available in a publication or in other places that the researchers have put information. So providing links to that information, references to that information as part of your communication is obviously a way that researchers can tackle this. And then finally, as the kind of third key area that we wanted to focus on is social media and similar platforms. So clearly, this is now a reality of research life. It's a very effective vehicle for research communication. There are myriad different forms of these communication platforms, all with their different challenges and opportunities. But for the most part, they are very short form, very interactive, and very immediate. And that creates challenges for researchers. So it can encourage really strong and simplistic messaging. And as has been indicated, that can be problematic both for openness, but also for communicating uncertainty. These environments can be combative, which, as well as potentially being unpleasant for the individuals involved, can push people towards extreme positions, perhaps to overhype their findings. And it can be difficult to provide the kind of clarity, the detail that perhaps you can in other forms of research communication. In addition to that, it can lead to confusion between personal views and professional views. So I'll talk about this again on the next slide, but by that I effectively mean that as researchers, as professional researchers, we come with a kind of an inbuilt trust or kudos that gives weight to the views that our researchers give on their areas of expertise. And if one moves outside of one's expertise to an area that perhaps the one isn't expert in and start giving personal views, it's important those aren't mixed up with the views on which one is an expert or a professional. Because obviously if those personal views are less expert, less supported by research and the effort that people put into their research findings, that can undermine the trust that people have in researchers. So again, to look at the what we can do from the institutional and the researcher point of view. So it's important that research institutions are not restricting people unnecessarily on social media. It is a very, very important way of communicating. And as I've said, that is a essential part of our mission as universities. And so what we should be trying to do is empowering our researchers to be able to communicate effectively and with integrity on social media through tools, knowledge, expertise. And again, that means that we need to think about our guidance, our training, and our support. And that is something that is already in place in many universities for research communications training, but can be kind of imbued with the principles of research integrity coming from the research integrity agenda. And then researchers themselves, they can balance clear messaging with referrals to more detailed and nuanced information, as I've indicated before. But also there are specific things that we can do on social media to help to ensure trust is maintained. So being polite, being professional, and being respectful is clearly key to a trustworthy and professional message. We can make sure that we differentiate between our personal and professional views, setting out very clearly what has been supported by research and what is actually just a personal view that you're expressing. And you can also ensure that you step back from discussions where necessary. So this is to avoid any kind of moving into overhype, pushing yourself into positions where you perhaps say things that you wouldn't normally say, overemphasize things in a way that you wouldn't normally do. So I'm pretty much come to the end of my time, and I just want to kind of conclude with the kind of core message. And effectively, the core message is this, that we already have a lot of support in universities around how to communicate with the media, how to get out there and communicate our messages. We also have lots of support around research integrity and good research practice. What I would like this paper to do, and what I would like kind of its impact to be, is to try and integrate those two things as well as we can across the universities in LERU and beyond. So for us, for people like me, for research integrity professionals, we need to really have at the front of our mind that research integrity doesn't stop at academic publication. That when we deliver training, when we deliver support and guidance, this needs to go into the research communications space. But then also in the where we deliver research communications training, we should emphasize that this is a key part of building a culture of research integrity, and research integrity should form part of that training and guidance and support. So this often won't be about creating new training and guidance, but enhancing what we already have. And then more generally, as a sector, as people working in this area, I want to encourage more cooperation and discussion between research communications and research integrity professionals. I'm hoping that this will be a spur to more discussions between the two groups so that we can learn from each other and so that we can improve the support, guidance, and help that we provide to our research community, because it's doing that that will ensure that our research has integrity throughout the research process. And that's everything that I wanted to say. And so thank you very much for listening. And I believe I'm going to hand back over to Kurt to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Reese, for highlighting the key issues of this new paper. Excellent job, I would say. And I've been looking in the chat if there are meanwhile any questions of the audience, so the audience can send in questions through the chat that we then will tackle later on through the panel debate. But perhaps before we go to the panel debate, Reese, perhaps one or two small remarks or questions from my side to bridge to the panel. I think that the paper rightly emphasizes a lot the issue of communication by researchers on social media platforms, which is a very challenging thing to do nowadays. I don't know if you have specific recommendations there that you could put forward next to what you already said during your presentation. And secondly, I was also wondering, hearing you busy, I was also wondering if the present climate of research security, knowledge theft, and developments like that, do you see as somebody who is really active on the academic working floor with people on this issue, have you seen an increasing reluctancy to communicate about their research findings because of these developments?
Thanks, Kurt. I'll answer those backwards if that's okay. So as Kurt's indicated, one of the other kind of major agendas in research administration is around kind of research security and the importance of protecting our research, particularly the kind of the higher risk research. And so I do sense that these two, the importance of communicating research and the importance of protecting research are inevitably, to some extent, in conflict. And so talking to researchers within my university and other universities, I do get a sense more and more of a nervousness about talking about certain types of research where the governments of Europe are interested in protecting the kind of the crown jewels of our kind of research findings. And so it's somewhere where I think we need to support our researchers more, because quite often governments aren't really saying that they don't want researchers to talk about these issues. So quite often when research has been published, and they really do still want researchers to go out and talk and to collaborate internationally, it is more about protecting unpublished research and protecting kind of the kind of the advantage that we have in our kind of research expertise across Europe, and trying to pull those two things apart and ensure people don't over worry and it start to impact our kind of open science agenda, which is equally as important, I think is a big mission for people going forward, and one that we're going to have to put more and more time and effort into. Then on your first question around social media, so we did think a bit about kind of some key messages for this, and some of them I've kind of indicated on in the presentation. But some of the other things that we've included as recommendations in the paper is to really when you're working on social media, to think about how the public will perceive the comments that you've made. So have you presented your research in a way that is both clear but also kind of professional and polite, so that people will kind of take it in the best possible way. To think about whether it is kind of obvious from what you've put out there, how the public can find more information on what you're talking about, so that they can kind of go into more detail, find out about any kind of uncertainties or alternate explanations that might exist from what you're talking about. But in particular, the thing that I really didn't talk about in this presentation was that universities should ensure that they have support and guidance and help for researchers who feel uncomfortable on social media, either because they're being personally attacked or because they don't know how to handle what can be quite a difficult and combative environment. And so for researchers, I think it's important that they know where their sources of support are within institutions, so that they can go and get that information and support, because it is often in those sorts of situations where things get out of hand and perhaps people do start to say things that might undermine their kind of credibility, which I think is one of the key things that we want to avoid.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Reese. I see that already a number of questions are coming in through the chat. We will keep them for the Q&A that we have after the panel debate, but it's time now that we move on to the panel debate. And I'm very happy that we have this morning 3 panelists with us to comment on the paper that Reese just presented. We have Dr. Helen Jamieson, we have Dr. Magdalena Skipper, and we have Mr. Bert Segers, who have been so kind to join us this morning in this panel. Helen is the global coordinator for the Science Media Centers, an international network of organizations whose mission is to improve the way the media cover science by supporting scientists to engage. And Helen is a neuroscientist by training, so she certainly knows from a very difficult and complex background how this should be done. We are very happy that Magdalena is also with us. Magdalena is a geneticist by training, but obviously we all know her as the editor-in-chief of Nature and chief editorial advisor for the Nature portfolio. Welcome, Magdalena. And finally, we have Bert Segers. As I already said, Bert is a mathematician by training. So we have a nice, diverse group here this morning, I would say. Bert is the secretary of the Flemish Commission for Research Integrity already since 2014. And this commission is what I would call the second advice organ, reinvesting cases of alleged research misconduct in Flanders. Next to that, Bert is also on the board of NRIO, the European Network of Research Integrity Offices. So welcome, all 3 of you, and let me perhaps give immediately the floor to Helen for a first, let's say, 5-minute reaction, just like her 2 colleagues will get in 5 minutes, and then we can open up the panel debate together with Reese, and then after that, reach out to the audience. So Helen, if you could start off.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, Kurt, and everybody at LERU for inviting me. And Reese, it's fascinating to hear about your paper, and to everybody on the call who's joined us this morning. As somebody who has worked in research communication for almost 20 years now, it's just fantastic to see so much interest and kind of commitment to the issues that we're here to talk about. When I left science to work in communication many years ago, all my academic colleagues kind of joked that I'd moved over to the dark side and I'd sold my soul. So it's really nice to see that we now have a very different view of the role of communication and the benefits that it brings, but also of the challenges that we all need to think about. The first thing that I wanted to say was I think we've come a huge way, as I've just mentioned and referred to. You know, research communication is something that's seen as very critical. It's a fully established profession across all of the institutes that we work in. And in many ways, we've won a lot of the arguments about why we need to communicate and the benefits that it brings. But I think, as Reese's paper shows, we've still got quite a long way to go. And I really agree with his recommendations and this suggestion that we really need to redouble our efforts to make sure that we can tackle the challenges that we face in communicating, and also make sure that we don't undermine the progress that we've all kind of worked so hard to bring over the years. I think these days although we've won a lot of their arguments, I think, as Kurt just was hinting at in his first question, there are still huge amounts of challenge with communicating. And we have lots of experience of this at the Science Media Centre, where researchers tell us if their early career, they don't often have enough time to be able to do this. They feel under pressure to publish papers. They don't have the support sometimes of their senior colleagues. They're worried about risking their own personal reputation and what that might do to their career. the senior researchers who've done a lot of communicating, some of them now experiencing a lot of harassment and online abuse, and that's kind of putting many of them off. And then I think at a broader institutional level, something that we also see is that amidst these times where we have a really bewildering, rapidly developing media landscape, a lot of fraught public debate, a lot of universities and institutions, not all of them, but some of them, taking a slightly more risk-averse approach and actually taking a step back from communication, so communicating less, not more. And I would argue that that's bad for them, actually, and obviously ultimately bad for the public. But the good things, and I think the kind of the real assets that we have that give me optimism for the future and how we'll tackle these challenges, a couple of things that Rhys mentioned a few times in his paper that I just wanted to pick out before I pass on to the next panelist. And the first one that I think is public trust. There's really high levels of public trust in scientists and researchers. The public trust researchers to tell them the truth about the latest innovations. And poll after poll shows that this is at levels that would be the envy of politicians and journalists and lots of other sectors. And I think, so even though we have this narrative in our heads that the public are sick of experts, that there are declining levels of trust in kind of establishment and authority voices, it's not true for researchers. And I think we have a real opportunity here that we perhaps don't always make the most of. We've worked very hard to win that trust from the public, but we need to kind of keep demonstrating over and over again that we deserve that trust, so that when there are big issues in the media that relate to science or research that affect the public, we need to make sure that researchers individually and institutions are out there engaging accurately, explaining the uncertainties, communicating with integrity, as Rhys was talking about. We have all the benefits of science, that we can speak plainly, we can admit uncertainty, we can cope with lots of different viewpoints and disagreements. We don't rely on our ideology, we rely on evidence. And I think those things mean that we could, we have real opportunities, and the public want to hear from researchers and about research. So that was the first thing that I wanted to reflect on. And I think the second one was also that Rhys talked a few times about how we need to work better together across the sector, particularly between research integrity and research communications. And I come from the communications side, and I would say that the huge network of communications professionals that we have across our funders, our journals, our universities, our institutes, are a massive superpower. We have years of experience and expertise in dealing with exactly the types of things we're talking about today. I'm sure there are lots of them on the call who have social media guidelines and advice, and who have so much experience. And I think working closely with the Institute and with research integrity professionals is going to be brilliant, because it means we'll be greater than the sum of our parts. I think there are areas where we struggle as a profession and that we perhaps need more support. So when we've talked to press and communications experts, some of them don't have a huge amount of support within their institution. It depends where they are, how many resources they have available, but they don't always have the resources and support that they need, despite the expertise that they bring to the table. And many of them now have very, very busy, difficult, overwhelming and complicated jobs. And so I think there's a real chance that if we don't support them in the future, we risk that expertise, and we risk losing them from the field. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us all to work together and to support each other kind of in this joint endeavour. So I think I will leave it there and pass on to the next panelist, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, for these comments, and already a number of important points touched upon by you, I would say. Trust, cooperation with the communication people as such, but certainly something that is also a big issue that I've been looking at for a long time, namely this silent majority of researchers in institutions, and we're at the end of the day, we have an enormous amount of expertise available, but people just refrain from communicating because they are fed up with everything that is the consequence of that in many cases. And I think that this is really a very important point to be made. All right, let's move on to Magdalena now to see what is her view on this paper and what kind of comments or suggestions she's having. Magdalena, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me start like Helen did by thanking you to invite me to join you here. I think this is a hugely important issue that we're discussing here. And I really congratulate Rees and all the co-authors on this paper. It's really, really important, especially from the perspective of looking at communication through the lens of research integrity. So let me make a few comments, many of which will echo what Helen said, but on a few of the points, I will perhaps present an alternative or complementary slant. So one of the reasons that I particularly like extending this umbrella of research integrity to communication is because communication is all too often considered to be an afterthought in the life of researchers. And historically, and I do think it's historic, I think this perspective has changed, but historically it was often thought as the job of others. So researchers were there to do research and somebody else was going to communicate that information on their behalf. And there is a potential danger in perpetuating this, in my view, misconception, because we do have communication professionals who, of course, have a great deal of experience and can aid and extend and amplify this communication. But if you are the person who's doing the research, then surely you are the best placed to communicate all the nuance and all the caveats and all the potential of the research that has been done. So what I would like to emphasize in the context of this paper, and that's actually something I believe in very strongly, is that communicating science should be considered as part of doing science. It's not something that happens afterwards. It's part and parcel of what it means to do research. And incidentally, what also underpins that statement, or is implicit in that statement, is that to me, science communication is to all audiences. So you as a researcher, you communicate science to your peers, to the research community, and you also communicate the research to the broader public. I think making that very clear distinction between communicating research to your community and communicate research to the broader public is often unhelpful. Now, it's very clear that the detail, the language you're going to use is going to be different for different audiences. But then if you think about it, if you happen to be a geneticist, like I used to be a practicing geneticist, I would talk to genetics community differently from the way I would talk to Bert, who's a mathematician. So this distinction between the research community and the general public, I think, is artificially enhanced and emphasized, and perhaps actually prevents us from communicating effectively to our own communities, broader community of researchers, and then by extension, the widest possible community. You know, I sometimes flippantly talk about my grandmother on the bus. Now, moving a little bit, zooming in closer into the paper that Rees presented so insightfully just now, I just want to re-emphasize how important it is that we're talking about openness in that communication, that we're talking about transparency in the context of trust in science. And I completely agree with Helen. I repeat this all the time, that scientists continue to be the most trusted profession. And this comes out on surveys done by many different survey professionals, many different bodies and many different countries around the world. And then by drawing this parallel between communication and research per se, we are reminded that communication has to be done with integrity, that it has to be done with caveats, and I'll come back to this in a second. And very importantly, I'm really delighted that this is emphasized in the paper. It has to be done in an inclusive way, so that we communicate research. In communicating research, we give credit to all who deserve credit for the research that has been done, instead of elevating just a few who perhaps are spokes people for the research. So on the communication with the caveats, I think that whole focus on communicating uncertainty is incredibly important. I'll just very briefly touch on this. You will all recognize a certain strand of coverage of science or research more broadly in the general media, focusing on retractions of papers, on research misconduct. And there's a strand of communication which suggests that not all is well in the house of science, and science is somehow broken. Well, in part, I think the issue, the reason why there is this misunderstanding that scientific method is broken, is because inadvertently we have collectively, and we, I mean here in the broadest sense, constructed this notion that science is somehow immutable. So almost in some sectors of the public, there is this understanding that science is almost like religion. Once we say something is true, it is always true. Now, of course, we know that that's not exactly how it is. Many things are true, or I should say many things remained factually correct in certain circumstances, right? We always have these settings in science in which provide the caveats. And this very nicely relates to different modes of communication that in certain settings, there may not be to articulate these caveats. And I think that's an important point. The other point I want to make, and I'll close very, very shortly, is I want to stress the importance of that support for communication. I do not believe that support for communication exists in all institutions. And I think those where this support is well developed and functions well should be encouraged to share those learnings, how they've set it up, how this runs in the institutions. I think this is incredibly important. And another thing which is touched on in the paper, and we at Nature have written about extensively, is of course the fact that evaluation of researchers is really very unidimensional. And communicating science, both across all the audiences, should, in my view, be part of evaluating, assessing researchers, which goes hand in hand with what I said, the communication of research is really part of doing research. And you know, this reminder that European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity states that research integrity should include training in dissemination communication, I think is really, really important. And so, thank you very much, Bert. And so in closing, I would say, you know, sometimes we talk about there being a pressure to communicate on researchers, and I think, Reese, you used that phrase when you were presenting the paper. The question I'd like to pose and encourage us all to think is, how do we turn the pressure to communicate from desire to communicate? Scientists are so proud of what they've discovered, of what they've developed, depending on what they're working on. Of course, they want to communicate. So how can we make them more confident in doing so? So in other words, I think communication of science should be something that clearly is done thoughtfully, but not something that should be afraid of. The very final thing I would add is perhaps in response to some of the questions that Kurt, you asked Reese at the end, just as a reminder that just as research itself should be beyond and above political borders, should be the communication. And especially at a time when the world is becoming more fragmented, there is a tremendous opportunity for science diplomacy, and communication is really part of this. I mean, we have plenty of examples in history where science has pulled us together when in all other walks of life we were being pushed apart. So thank you again for the invitation to be part of this, and again, congratulations on the paper. I think it's really terrific.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Magdalena, for these very valuable comments, and I certainly have taken note of several of them, and I think that you're very right in saying a lot of people out there are very proud on what they are doing. So let's make sure that they are not afraid to communicate, and let's make sure as institutions that we do everything possible to make sure that they do that in a very nuanced and as correct as possible way. Let's move on to Bert now. Bert has been very enthusiastic already about a number of interventions, so I'm sure that he will be able to give a number of very positive, stimulating messages here this morning. Bert, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Kurt. First of all, it's an honor for me to be here, invited to the panel at the launch of the LERU report, and I really thank the authors also for the invitation. From the research integrity community, we also very much welcome the report and its recommendations. It's timely, it's spot on. I really couldn't think of a thing I don't agree with. And the report also echoes some voices we have heard earlier, like the Finnish initiative on responsible science communication. I recognize a few things. I have 7 things. There's 3 things I value that I will talk about, 3 more critical remarks, and 1 anecdote. First, the report signals a rise in attention for scientific communication. So scientific communication, real science communication, setting it apart from the inner circle, scholarly communication in papers, conferences, and pub peer. There is this rise in attention. The report speaks about a push to communicate findings and an increasing centrality of scientific communication and public engagement. I think that's true, and I expect that that is an important message on its own. This field will grow, I guess, and it's reports like this LERU report that will set the scene and that will lead and shape this maturing landscape. So that's why I welcome and value this first observation. Second, echoing what Magdalena valued, I also value the separate focus of the report on the duty of care of institutions. Your slideshow, Ries, has this orange frames for what institutions can do on top of the green frame of what researchers should do. The green frame is probably the easiest. It's easy to say what researchers should do, but they're not alone. It's not always easy to identify exactly what is the role of the institution here to support them. And of course, LERU as the League of European Research in Intensive Universities can make a difference here, and I think it does with this report. And third, I very much value the focus on communicating uncertainty, in fact, your second recommendation. As another anecdote, I ran the Young Academy of Belgium for the last 8 years, and with the members of the Young Academy, we formulated 4 principles for the future of science communication. And they align very much with your report's second recommendation of communicating uncertainty. It's really key to showing in communication to the public, if that exists, what science is really about. It's about doubting, it's about posing questions, it's about finding things and working together. And it's especially important to balance the communication of results, what we typically want to do, with the attention for the process, for the people, for the questions remaining. I promised you 3 critical remarks, although I agree with all what is in the report, but I'll go anyway. My first remark already questions what Magdalena praised, namely extending the umbrella of research integrity to communication. It might be a semantic issue, but in how far is it integrity? There's no doubt that all these recommendations about openness and communicating uncertainty and doing responsible social media communication are good practices, and we have to say, yes, you should do it like this. But it's not only the realm of research integrity, that has these norms for good practices, but also research ethics and open science, inclusion and diversity, and the umbrella term of responsible conduct of research. I think we have to be vigilant for some kind of mission creep or integrity creep, improperly widening the scope of the concept of research integrity. I'm not saying all of these recommendations are out of scope. Far to the contrary, they really can be. And I even agree with Magdalena that communication is part of the job. But that it's a matter of research integrity is not completely evident to me. Suboptimal science communication doesn't necessarily neglect the principles or the norms of research integrity. So it's a semantic issue, but I'm not entirely sure that integrity is the best word to put in the title of the report. The second critical remark is the absence of recognition and reward. On the one hand, yes, institutions should trust, support, and not restrict their researchers in science communication. But good science communication takes time. And those who don't engage in this science communication, well, quickly saying, they have more time to write more papers. Right? It is vital that this difference doesn't turn into a handicap for those who choose to communicate. So the institutional recruiting and assessment policies should take these communication efforts somehow into account, that science communication efforts at all are valued and recognized. Just recognizing only that a researcher engages in science communication at all, I think, is really important. So keeping away from the difficult question of what then is good and valuable science communication. And my third remark I made up while reading one of the questions in the chat from my former colleague Esther de Smet from Ghent University. We notice that science communication is really evolving nowadays. It's growing in number of phases. 20 years ago, many formats of public engagement we see today were not practiced or very, very limited. So this classical science communication, this one-way communication through the classical media, for example, is now blurring and sitting together with many other engagement formats, from policy influence to stakeholder engagement, citizen science, and so on. So perhaps the report could have better acknowledged this context and where this one-way communication is in the science communication landscape, but also explained its narrow focus on this classical science communication. It's not a critical remark because focus is important to have clear messages and clear recommendations. So I will end with one anecdote. The last recommendation in the report is on training. And of course, we very much welcome recommendations for training initiatives. I think we need really more of them. Training is possible both at the institutional level as on the national level. And let's also not forget that we see here also in the audience a landscape of freelance trainers who are not affiliated with an institution or a national level organization, but do training on their own. I want to end with this anecdote on training. At the first pages of the LERU report, it is noted that the ALEA Code of Conduct now requires institutions to ensure that researchers get proper training in research design, methodology analysis, and dissemination and communication. And these last two words were in fact our suggestion from ENRIO, from the European Network of Research Integrity Offices. I remember our Lithuanian colleague suggesting it, to add dissemination and communication to the list. In the 2017 version of the ALEA code, there was only design, methodology, and analysis. So we're really happy that the ALEA drafting group picked this up, and you could reference it as a part of the LERU report. So the circle is round, and I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Bert, for these positive and critical, constructive remarks. I think that you made a number of good points there. The issue of integrity, I think that certainly there is some value in what you are saying, that we would get into a kind of integrity creep. I noted down in my notes here. Obviously, the whole issue of recognitions and rewards, we already tackled that just before we went public with the event with release also. And then finally, of course, we are happy to be inspired, of course, by the LEA code. It's clear that we also contributed to the latest update in the means or with the means that we had. So thanks again, Bert, for these nice and certainly important comments on the report. Before we open up to the public now, I would like to give Rees the opportunity to react to a number of comments made by Helen, Magdalena, and Bert. Perhaps short, Rees, but
yeah,
I'm
I
sure
won't take up much time.
That you want to react to a number of the points made.
It's sorry, apologies, bit of a cough. Firstly, I always love these sorts of events because they get ideas that I've been working on kind of articulated so much better than I ever could from some of the colleagues here. It's really great to hear. And so first, I'm just going to kind of go briefly through a few notes. I think the point that Helen made around the trust in the research community has, I think, is extremely important. And I think it's extremely important both for framing this, but also for why it's so vital that we take these steps to protect it, because it is absolutely the most important thing that we have, and protecting it is absolutely vital. And I'd add that all the good work that we are doing in terms of research integrity, trying to ensure that our journal articles and books have integrity, could be hugely undermined by kind of failures in research communication, which actually could have much bigger impacts than a integrity issue in a journal article. So I think it's hugely important. And then I just wanted to come back on some of Magdalena's comments as well, which I thought were hugely helpful. And I think the how Magdalena articulated the move from pressure to communicate to desire to communicate is I think actually articulates everything that we were trying to say in the paper, in that what I would want to get out of this is that people don't feel pressures to communicate before they are ready, or when they don't have the ability to do so, or in scenarios that they feel is inappropriate, but rather that we provide them with the skills and the expertise to get out there and to do these things that they want to do in many cases, and overcome some of the things that Kurt mentioned around the kind of worry that and concern that is stopping people from getting out into the community and communicating. And then finally on Bert's comments, and Bert, thank you also for the bit of pushback, because it's always good to get kind of I think some kind of insightful and constructive feedback. On the question of integrity creep, I think I'd respectfully disagree that it is there, because I think, so you kind of using the UK's definition of integrity, it's honesty, openness, rigor, and transparency. I think are the kind of core aspects of this. And in my view, at least, in order for us to fulfill those kind of commitments that we make as part of the Research Integrity Concordat, we do need to apply some of these principles to research communication, because if we're open and transparent in our academic publications, and then not open and transparent in our wider communications, I think that undermines the whole concept. And so I think it is really important. And I think the issue of recognition and reward is something that maybe we should look at going forward, because I think it's incredibly important and incredibly useful, but also brings with it a whole host of other questions, because once you start putting a kind of question of giving someone a reward for doing more research communication, then you start bringing in questions of perverse incentives around, how do we measure communication? Is it the number of communications you've made? Because that then brings in questions around the same sort of questions we get for bringing out too many papers and putting pressure on people to produce loads of papers. So I think that could be another lovely kind of follow-up to this, is to look at that question. I think it's a really interesting one, and one that we should dig into. And other than that, I just want to say thank you to all three of you. It was really interesting, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Reese, for this first reaction on the comments by the panel. I see that we still have something like 12 minutes for this event, and I would like to use those 12 minutes for questions from the audience. I've been supported, of course, by my team behind the screens, and they sent a number of those questions to me. I'm not going to put them forward one by one, because otherwise we risk that we only are going to deal with one question of the audience. So I've selected a few of them, which I will launch now, and it's, I would say, up to Reese or the panel members to comment on one or more of them along the lines that they think that they can contribute to the answer to those questions. The first question is already immediately a very provocative and important one. How do you all evaluate science communication during the COVID pandemic? The second question, is there a kind of optimal form of collaboration between researchers and communication departments within institutions? Coming back to what was said earlier during the panel, that we need to improve the collaboration between the researchers on the one hand and the professionals in communication on the other hand. Third important question that I picked from the list here, is there a certain influence of the private sector on science communication, certainly when this private sector is funding research and is waiting for results. Another issue that was raised by the audience is what would be the major ethical issues in communicating research in an open way? And then finally, shouldn't we put integrity in communication in science communication courses as an independent topic, which is, as Magdalena already said, not available in every institution still today. So these are a few of a kind of first cohort of questions. I see that other ones are still coming in, but perhaps that we can start the debate or the reactions on the basis of those questions. I don't know if somebody feels inclined to start first. Okay, Magdalena, just go ahead.
Thank you. I will pick just one of the questions that you conveyed to us, and that's about the private sector. It's actually something that fits very nicely with something I've been spending a bit of time thinking about. So let me share my thoughts with you. I think we unnecessarily draw a line between the public sector in which research unfolds, and of course that's more than academia, because there are other non-university based research centers, and the private sector. There is a great deal of research and development happening in the private sector, and increasingly the private sector is communicating that research in the form of scientific publication. You know, as you know already, my background is in genetics. Look at today's medicine. A lot of the advances that we already benefit from, and certainly been published over the last 2 decades, have been made either in the private sector, in the pharma, or as a result of pharma and public sector collaboration. So I think we should think about the private sector as not just an entity that purely commercializes. Now, of course, that's a key driver for the private sector. But increasingly, the private sector funds a great deal of research, some of which is fundamental. So when we think about science communication in this broadest sense that I always advance, so both within the research community, which now consists of the public and private sector, and beyond that research community, we must include the private sector. And actually the public-private collaborations, of which there are many and increasing in number, a wonderful opportunity for us collectively to think, regardless of whether we are just driven by discoveries or also driven by commercialization of these discoveries, we do have a common goal somewhere along the way. So this is not a definitive answer to this, but I think the principles that we're discussing here should absolutely apply to all communication of science in all settings, and we should work towards following these principles collaboratively across sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very nuanced position, Magdalena, which I fully agree with, of course. Let's move to Helen, perhaps.
Is that okay, Bert? Did you? Yeah. Okay. So I would just completely echo what Magdalena was just said about industry connections, and from a public perspective, I think we've got a real challenge at the moment that there is a narrative that industry equals bad, publicly funded equals good, particularly for research and researchers who need to declare conflicts of interest and things like that. And we see it play out in so many issues. And I think it's not just for the researchers to declare their interests. I think the sector as a whole, I think government, I think the higher education sector needs to keep making the case to the public why collaboration and research in industry is important. So I would completely agree with what she said. About communication between researchers and communications people in your institutes. If you're a researcher, seek them out really early. Don't wait till you get in their publication. As somebody else has said on the panel today, we wait till the end, or we think it might be someone else's job. Do it much earlier on. There's much more a comms team can do to help you if they have a lot more advance notice. And also try to go with them with what you want the objective of your communication to be. So what happens a lot is we get right through the kind of scientific process, you're nearly ready to publish, and then a researcher might go to a comms person and say, please can you do me a press release because I need to get this out there. And actually what you need to go to them with is, this is the group of people I would really like to tell, or who really need to know about this. How can you best help me do this? And then they will give you their advice based on your level of communication experience, the audiences you're trying to reach, and your understanding of those audiences. And so work with them in a really collaborative way. And then I think make sure that after the event, either you or they go back to your senior leaders and other people and tell them about what you've done and what you've communicated, and make sure that you're doing that PR for yourself, because a lot of people fall down on that. They don't always then go and tell people, hey, we've done this great communications and this is what it's led to. And then very quickly on the pandemic, I just think we could have a whole other session about how communications unfolded during the pandemic. My view is that there were really, really fantastic bits of communication during the pandemic. We saw in the UK and in lots of other countries, day after day after day, of academics and researchers braving the media fray and social media to communicate about very difficult topics that were really complicated and really scary for the public. And I just hugely applaud that. And actually to have members of my family, as Magdalena talks about, talking to your gran or your auntie, talking to me about vaccines and flow tests and things like this that they would never have been interested in before. That's great. But I do think there were a lot of missed opportunities. I think there were some academics who put their head above the parapet and got shot down, and then the scientific sector didn't really stand up for them. Everybody retreated into they're not at our institute, so that's not for us to worry about, when actually there was an argument about supporting researchers who are out there trying to do something difficult. And I think there have been also surveys that have showed that despite the huge amounts of work that went on in universities during the pandemic to help tackle it, the public have got a very low level of awareness of the role, particularly of universities in research, in how we tackled the pandemic, because we didn't always engage, particularly collectively as a field. But that's just a tiny snapshot of my view. So I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, and thank you for defending us also in the COVID pandemic period. I think they're fully right on that. Let's move on to Bert so that we can give the final word, and to Reese to conclude this event. Bert, please.
Yeah, I prepared to also answer the very first question about COVID and the pandemic communication. How could we evaluate that? Yeah, I think we saw great things. I think the effect is that in terms of public trust in science, the gap has widened. A lot of people who already trusted science have heightened their trust in science. They got to read more, and their their trust was enhanced even. Those who are already turning away from science a bit might have become lost in conspiracy theories or something, and might have gotten entrenched in turning their back to science. We will have learned a lot, and I remember one case in Flanders when there was a public disagreement between scientists that was really smeared out in the media as if it were a political disagreement. And let me just, for that, read one part of our Principles for the Future of Science Communication from the Young Academy. In their communication, scientists and science journalists can place research within a consensus-building framework to strengthen support and trust in science and in their work. This avoids science communication as PR, focusing too much on individuals, like the top scientist discourse. A second advantage is that a focus on consensus avoids the image of science as a political game with different camps or factions. It is not always useful to outline a scientific debate in terms of proponents and opponents of an idea, or to let dissidents necessarily have their say. It may be more useful to indicate how different groups have provided pieces of the puzzle.
That's very nice, Bert. That's very nice. Good for the Young Academy. Thank you very much for that. And then finally, let's give the floor to Reese again for a number of final comments.
Thanks, Kurt. I'm going to talk very briefly about the pandemic and then try and address the two questions that are remaining very briefly. So I think I agree with everything that's been said on the response to the pandemic question. The other thing I would add is my feeling of the whole period is that the challenges that we outline in the paper were supercharged during the pandemic period. So everything was done a lot faster. There was a lot more interest, a lot more pressure on people to communicate things in very one-dimensional ways and to get those messages out. And so I think one of the reasons why this topic is so important, and particularly the issue of ensuring people have the right training and support in place, is that if we ever ended up in another situation like that, where something else was creating that kind of supercharged version of the challenges that researchers face, that everybody is better prepared for it and able to feel confident in going out and communicating, even when the kind of storms are raging and it's difficult. So that's just a little addition to that question. Then on the question of the ethical issues of communicating openly, so I think it does create challenges, particularly for certain types of research. So those researchers who are working with personal data, sensitive data, and Kurt mentioned kind of research security sensitive issues as well. I think those create ethical challenges in terms of how far we should communicate that information, what protections need to be put in place, particularly if it is personal data or sensitive data relating to individuals. And so balancing those two things is really important and something that we need to make sure that we get right. And so this is where research ethics committees and other forms of advice and support come in and can help researchers get it right on those issues. And then finally, there was a question around integrity and communication training being a kind of independent standalone session for researchers. I think clearly in a big institution with lots of resource, that would be great, but I don't think it is the only way to tackle this problem. So we obviously need to make sure that researchers in small institutions who don't have the resource are also able to benefit from these sorts of kind of ideas and insights. And so integrating integrity into existing courses in any way that starts to get people thinking about these sorts of issues is going to be beneficial. And so for those who maybe don't have the resource to create new courses, I think it's still there's still things that can be done in order to make sure that we try and address these issues. And I think that's everything I want to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Reese, and thank you for the reflections on those other questions also, so that we at least could tackle some 5 or 6 questions from the audience. So that brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to the end of this event. I must say, looking at the turnout for this event, looking at the very positive reactions, I must say that I'm very glad that within LERU we have chosen this topic to work on. Initially, it was a little bit strange to bring our communication group together with our research integrity group and embarking on this topic. But I think that as well, the paper, the reactions, the discussion today has proven what an important topic it is, and how a lot of people out there in our institutions are struggling with this issue. And as I already said earlier today, and as Magdalena indicated, we have a lot to be proud about. So let's make sure that we can support our people and make sure that they also can communicate in a confident, reliable, and correct way. Having said this, I just would like to remind all of you that the paper now will be online on our website, that the webinar will be available on YouTube, and that I would like to thank Rees again for his leadership on this paper, for his presentation here today. I would like to thank Bert, Magdalena, and Helen for their comments today and positive reactions and comments to the paper. And I would like to thank all of you out there, the big audience that we had today, for the participation and for the questions. I'm sure that our LERU groups will be very pleased with these reactions today. Finally, I would like to call upon all of you to keep track of our activities. A lot is going on in Europe's research, innovation, and education world. As you all know, we will stay on top of that. And a next paper that you can expect from us, hopefully still to be out this year, is on European University Alliances, a long expected paper on a not so easy topic also. So we certainly all look forward to that. So thank you very much once again for participating today, and hope to see you all soon again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.